First of all, Scott, thanks a lot that you accepted our proposal to talk about international relations. I really appreciate. First of all, as you know, I would like to discuss with you the whole complex of US-Russia relations. But I will start with actual issue because it's, I think, the most challenging one about Hamas and all this mess in the Middle East. So my first question to you is, do you think it's purely Hamas initiative? And if so, what are the Hamas goals? I mean, this attack on Israel, is it a purely Hamas initiative, or is it Iranian game?
Well, to answer that question, we have to address, the goals and objectives of three specific entities, one being Hamas, the second being Hezbollah, and the third being Iran. So let's reverse engineer this. Let's start with Iran. Iran is a nation that has been struggling with the with the issue of regional instability for some time. Iran has been the whipping boy for all sorts of accusations, whether it be from promoting terrorism to building a nuclear weapon, things of this nature. Economic sanctions have been leveled against Iran. The United States has taken a policy position together with Israel to limit Iran's ability to interact with the world, and Iran has successfully resisted this. Iran has just concluded, or is in the process of concluding, a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia that had been brokered by the Chinese. Iran had just joined the BRICS organization. Iran is a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran is a nation that's redefined its relationship with Russia in a positive way from an Iranian perspective, and with China. Iran is a nation whose government has been promising its people economic prosperity if they just have the perseverance to outlast the sanctions regime of the West. Iran is on the cusp of this, of realizing this change, of emerging from the shadows of economic sanctions to become a nation that will be engaging with the international community to the fullest of its potential. The last thing Iran needed was a regional conflict over Israel. So from a strategic standpoint, this makes no sense whatsoever for Iran to have been involved in this. Hezbollah. Hassan Nasrallah is the head of Hezbollah, a political party that has a very powerful armed faction, militia. The militia is there to resist Israeli occupation of Lebanon. Hezbollah was formed in the aftermath of the 1982 Israeli invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon, became a resistance movement that successfully, by itself, with the assistance of Iran, but by itself defeated the Israeli army, compelled Israel to withdraw from southern Lebanon, and then continued to resist because Israel held on to territories, the Sheba Farm area adjacent to the Golan Heights, continued to resist. And in 2006, Israel fought a war, 33-day war, designed to eradicate Hezbollah, but Hezbollah survived, persevered. But the 2006 victory of Hezbollah came at a horrible cost for Lebanon. The Israeli army, the Air Force bombed West Beirut, the neighborhood of Dahiwa. That became part of an Israeli philosophy now of collective punishment. The Dahiwa principle was born there. Hassan Nasrallah today is the Hezbollah is a very important political party in Lebanon. Lebanon is a nation undergoing tremendous political stress, economic stress, and Hezbollah is trying to emerge as a leader worthy of not just the Shia, but of Lebanon. So they are seeking to stabilize the political situation in Lebanon, to stabilize the economic situation. The last thing Hezbollah needs is a war with Israel. It's putting Hezbollah in the exact wrong direction. So now we come to Hamas. Hamas is an entity that was politicized in 2005, 2006 by Israel to become a governance organization, to challenge what had been the unilateral control over the Palestinian process enjoyed by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Palestinian Authority, Fatah. Hamas emerged. Israel helped funnel money in from Qatar to turn it into this political entity. They won the election in 2006, won the majority of the seats. Then Israel helped create the conditions for a civil war between Hamas and Fatah, designed to split the Palestinian support base so that the Palestinians would be fundamentally weakened by Hamas. Hamas became the governing authority of Gaza. And from 2006 onwards, what Hamas has seen is Israel basically turning Gaza into an open air concentration camp. 2+ million Palestinians with no future, no airfield, no ports facility, employment dictated by Israel. It was unacceptable. They'd also seen a shift in international opinion and support for a Palestinian homeland. The Abrams Accord in 2019, pushed by the United States, the Trump administration with Israel, talks about a Palestinian state, but set forth conditions for a Palestinian state that were unsustainable, unreachable, meaning that there will be no Palestinian state. The final nail in the coffin was going to come with Israel normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia, and there was active discussion ongoing for that. Thousands of Palestinians have been taken prisoner by Israel, being held by Israel indefinitely with no due process. This was an unresolved issue. And then Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third most holiest place in the Islamic religion, in the Muslim faith, was being desecrated on a regular basis by Israel, and the Palestinian Authority was doing nothing about this. So from a Hamas perspective, if they allowed the status quo to go forward, if they bought into the conditions set by Israel, for instance, Israel was bribing Hamas by increasing the number of work permits from 10,000 to 20,000. Israel believed that Hamas could be bought off in this fashion. Hamas recognized that if they didn't take action, decisive action to change this paradigm, that it was all over for the Palestinian people, for the people of Gaza. So Hamas launched an attack on October 7th that was well prepared. This wasn't a spontaneous action. This was an action that had been planning for over a year. It was done without any Hezbollah or Iranian support or knowledge. They knew nothing about this. Hassan Nasrallah admitted that as much in his presentation last Friday, where he said, we didn't know anything about this. We weren't even able to begin to come up with a response until October 9th because we're trying to figure out what had happened. Iran was the same way. Hamas did this because they want to put Palestine back on the front burner. Right now, the entire world is acknowledging, except Israel, is acknowledging that no matter what happens between Hamas and Israel, that there will have to be a Palestinian state. This is a huge victory for Hamas and for the Palestinian people, because without October 7th, nobody talking about a Palestinian state today. Nobody. This is a huge victory for Hamas. Hamas has taken hundreds of Israelis hostage, many of them soldiers, many of them civilians. It's a horrible thing to take people hostage, but understand what they're doing. They're trying to leverage the hostages into a chip that can be exchanged for the thousands of Palestinians that are held in Israeli prisons today without charges, without due process. They will probably get some sort of exchange. This is a huge victory for Hamas. And Hamas is going to insist on Israel changing its approach towards the Al-Aqsa Mosque to guarantee the right of Muslims to worship, etc. The international community will support this. This is a huge victory for Hamas. This is all that Hamas wants. Hamas is not seeking the destruction of Israel. Hamas is not seeking to manifest from the river to the sea. Hamas is seeking a Palestinian state. Hamas is seeking return of the thousands of Palestinian prisoners, and Hamas is seeking security for the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's their goals, that's their objectives. Hezbollah and Iran have nothing to do with this.
Okay, so you believe that Hamas attacked Israel in order to remind to the whole world about the Palestinian state. Okay, but what's next? Now Israel is devastating Gaza Strip. And what is your forecast about the military campaign, the military operation that Israel starts after the surprise attack by Hamas?
Hamas knows that in the long term, if it's just a Hamas-Israel equation, that Hamas will lose. It doesn't have the ability to sustain the fight the way Israel does. So Hamas has to change the political paradigm, because war is an extension of politics by other means. Hamas must change the political paradigm. So Hamas executed what I believe to be a flawless military operation on October 7th. They took the Israelis by surprise, and they defeated the IDF in a stand-up fight. A lot of people don't understand that the IDF had active duty battalions there that were defeated by Hamas in a stand-up fight. But when that finished, there's only a couple thousand Hamas fighters above ground. Israel can mobilize 300,000. And if Hamas stood and fought outside of the wall, they all would have been killed. Many of them were killed. So they took hostages and they withdrew to a place that they designed, underground passageways, tunnels, fortresses, weapons storage, all that, to lure Israel into Gaza. The purpose of the Hamas action was to humiliate Israel, setting the political conditions for an Israeli overreaction, which Israel has done by going into Gaza. It's the most predictable thing in the world would be that Israel would bomb the Palestinian civilians. Why? Because Israel, since 2006, has instituted the mowing the grass principle, the Dahiwa, named after a West Beirut suburb that was flattened by Israel in 2006. It's part of its collective punishment approach towards the Lebanese people for being seen as supporting Hezbollah. From 2008 onwards, Israel has used the same principle to punish the people of Gaza. So it was predictable that by taking hostages, by embarrassing the Israeli military and withdrawing back into the Gaza Strip, that Israel would bomb the Palestinian people. This was part of the Hamas plan, straight up. They knew Israel would do this, and they were hoping that the suffering of the Palestinian people that would be accrued would turn international opinion against Israel. Had Israel on October 8th simply resecured the border and then stopped and turned to the international community and said, what do we do about Hamas? Hamas would have been in a lot of trouble, because there would have been millions of people in the streets of the cities around the world demonstrating on behalf of Israel, because Israel had been attacked by Hamas. But instead, Israel overreacted and flipped the script. Right now, millions of people are demonstrating around the world, including in Washington, D.C., hundreds of thousands, against Israel. This is unprecedented, and it's created tremendous political pressure on nations around the world to address this issue. This is why the Palestinian state is now being discussed, because of the change in the political dynamic outside. In Israel, Hamas knew that Benjamin Netanyahu was a prime minister in trouble, political trouble. On October 6th, on October 5th, there were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Israelis protesting in the streets of Tel Aviv and elsewhere against Benjamin Netanyahu because of his rewriting of Israeli basic law, seeking to turn the judiciary from an independent branch of government into a subordinate element of the legislature to protect Benjamin Netanyahu from being prosecuted on corruption charges. There were people saying we won't even fight for Israel. The Israeli president was talking about the potential of a civil war between Israel, a shooting war between Israelis. This was the reality on October 6th. On October 7th, Benjamin Netanyahu is now a man who has presided over the worst security failure in the history of Israel. He's the prime minister that says, I am Mr. Security. I can guarantee security. He failed. The Israeli Defense Force was thought to be this invincible force. They got beat. Israeli intelligence was supposed to be the best in the world. They couldn't detect this. They didn't predict this. Benjamin Netanyahu, under any normal circumstance, would be removed from office immediately for incompetence. But he's turned this war into a life, basically a life vest. He's remaining afloat because he's rallying people. But as international opinion turns, as Israel becomes a political liability abroad, so many nations are terminating relations with Israel. This is difficult for Israel economically speaking. Having 300,000 reservists taken from their jobs, put in the army, is destroying the Israeli economy. And the Israeli economy is what makes Israel viable. Benjamin Netanyahu's political days are over. So a lot of people are saying, well, Hamas failed because Netanyahu has this hard line, this strong line. He's not going to be prime minister. He's going to leave. Somebody's going to take his place who will be put under the pressure to reach a compromise solution with Hamas. So this is a tremendous political victory for Hamas.
Hamas achieved his most important goal. Now we discuss the creation of Palestinian state, but do you truly believe that all these discussions will finally result in the creation of an independent Palestinian state, a Palestine, or not? It will be just talks and nothing more.
History shows that it's going to be very difficult for people to actually genuinely talk about a Palestinian state. What I can say is that Hamas has created the conditions where such discussion can take place. There are a couple elements here. One, the Palestinian Authority is going to have to step up to the plate, because no matter what, Israel will never talk with Hamas about the future of a Palestinian state. Israel will only negotiate with the Palestinian Authority. So far, the Palestinian Authority has been very weak in its response. They've been given this golden opportunity to actually create a Palestinian state. Yet because of the political differences between Fatah and Hamas, they're not acting. So we need the Palestinian Authority to step up to the plate. And I believe they have to, because otherwise Hamas will take over the Palestinian government, which is the last thing they want. The last thing the Arab nations around the world want. Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu will have to be eradicated from office. So will the right wing. The political right of Israel must be nullified because of this crisis. And there must be a centrist, a moderate wing that recognizes that the only path towards the salvation of Israel is the creation of a legitimate Palestinian state. The United States is going to have to distance itself from Israeli politics. Right now, Israeli politics dictates the political tone in Washington, D.C. We saw that when the new Speaker of the House came in. His first words weren't how he's going to help the American people, how he's going to end homelessness, deal with health care. He said, I'm talking about giving money to Israel. The United States has to distance itself from Israel so that we can put real pressure on Israel to genuinely talk about a Palestinian state. We need Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia to be serious about a Palestinian state. They're saying the right things now, but as you said, if this conflict calms down, will they just once again fall back? Here's where I think Hamas has an important role. Hamas has more stature today because of what they've done. In the West, it's difficult to talk about Hamas because they're labeled as a terrorist organization. But for instance, Turkey recognizes them as a liberation movement, a resistance movement, as jihadists, people fighting mujahideen. And I think in the Arab world, Hamas is, look, you get a lot of street credibility in the Arab street by beating Israel. And Hamas has done what no other Arab army other than Hezbollah has done, beat Israel. And so I think Hamas will be able to keep the pressure on. I do believe that this time has the potential, real potential, of producing a Palestinian state. Whether it's a two-state solution, a one-state solution, frankly, is up to Israel. The longer this conflict goes, the weaker Israel becomes. The weaker Israel becomes, the more likelihood that there will be a one-state solution, which Israel doesn't want. The sooner this conflict ends, the stronger Israel is, the more likely that it'll be a two-state solution. So there's a sliding, spectrum there that plays into account here. But I believe that this time there's real potential. But politics is politics, and the Palestinian people have a history of being betrayed by everybody. So once again, if they don't stand up, especially if the Palestinian Authority doesn't stand up and start to assert itself forcefully on the issue of a Palestinian state, we could find yet again the Palestinian people are made promises and then are lied to.
Okay, the escalation in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine are two conflicts that lead to the growth of conflict potential in the world politics. Some experts say that this is only the beginning, and in the near future we may face with much more escalation. Do you agree, or is it too gloomy forecast? Do you expect that other conflicts will be opened? That all this conflict potential will not be limited only to Ukraine and Gaza Strip?
Well, let's start with Ukraine since it came first. there was a lot of concern that this would turn into a general war between NATO and Russia. But in order to have a war, you have to have parties capable of fighting such a war. Russia made it clear early on that it wasn't interested in a fight with NATO. In fact, the Russian military that invaded Ukraine, or whatever term you want to use, the special military operation, was a very modest military force, 200,000. That's not enough to take on a nation the size of Ukraine. Ukraine's army was 3 times as big as the Russian military. It was a limited objective conflict designed to, stay focused on the issue of the Donbass, etc. It expanded when NATO refused to allow Ukraine to negotiate a peace with Russia back in April of 2022. NATO instead rebuilt the Ukrainian army. It had been largely defeated by Russia up until that time. $45 billion Lend-Lease program, training 60,000 new Ukrainian soldiers with this new equipment, and they expanded the war. And we saw that in the offensive that took place in September, October of 2022 that recaptured Kharkov, which recaptured the right bank of Kherson. The war stabilized. Russia mobilized. Russia received 300,000 plus volunteers. They've gone through 2 drafts, so they've built their army. Russia's expanded its military from 900,000 to 1.5 million. That's outside of the special military operation. That's 600,000 for the military, plus 600,000 for the special military operation. That's 1.2 million men that Russia's brought into military service in the course of the last year. NATO, on the other hand, struggles to supply Ukraine. They've stripped their armories, bare. They can't produce enough ammunition to supply Ukraine, let alone sustain an actual conflict with Russia. They have given political lip service to forming a 300,000 rapid response force, but they don't have the manpower to do it. The British army today is so small that if you put it into a large soccer stadium, for instance, the Dynamo Stadium in Moscow, you'd have 30,000 unsold seats because it's just not a very big military at all. The rest of NATO has not prepared for this kind of war. You can't have a war unless you're capable of fighting this war. NATO cannot fight this war. There's zero potential of the Ukraine conflict blowing up into a global conflict because NATO can't fight that war. It has no potential, and Russia doesn't desire to fight that war. All of Russia's actions are designed to defend Russia or to prevail in Ukraine. But Russia's not building an offensive-minded military designed to take over Europe. So I think what's happening is Russia's victory has been all but conceded by the West. The West today is no longer talking about a Ukrainian victory. They're talking about a negotiated settlement. They're talking about we have to learn how to manage Russian victory, etc. That means that they've surrendered already. Politically, they've surrendered. So there's no potential of this conflict in Europe exploding anymore. It's been, I think a Russian victory is all but assured, and Europe has accepted that. There will be a difficult peace, but I don't think there's a danger of a war. In the Middle East, it's a very dangerous situation because the suffering of the Palestinian people brings with it so much emotional, such a strong emotional charge. But as I said, neither Hezbollah nor Iran want to escalate. This isn't in their best interests. And so I see that, and the United States doesn't want to escalate. Israel doesn't want to escalate because they all know that if it escalates, it becomes a regional conflict where they all suffer. Nobody wins. And it has the potential of becoming even more. If Iran were to fire its missiles and threaten Israel with physical destruction, Israel has a nuclear weapon, and it would be used against Iran. And if Israel uses a nuclear weapon against Iran, Pakistan may very well use a nuclear weapon against Israel. So, and then the war, now we're talking about nuclear war, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dead. Nobody wants this. So I do believe that, and again, I take a cue from Hassan Nasrallah's speech last Friday. In conflict management circles in academia, they speak of horizontal conflict or escalation management. And I think Hassan Nasrallah has perfected that art, and he is in the business of working with Iran, with the United States, with Israel, to do horizontal escalation management, to allow where pressure builds up, to allow the latitude for the pressure to be blown. And when I say pressure, I'm talking about people being killed. Over 60 Hezbollah soldiers have died. Israel's lost a number of soldiers on that front. More people will die, but it's not blown up into general war. Shia militias in Syria and Iraq are attacking the United States. They've wounded, well over 45 Americans. Normally, we'd be talking about blowing them off the face of the earth, but we're doing limited strikes, pressure relief to keep the situation controlled while the Hamas-Israeli conflict plays itself out politically. So I believe that there's a great risk. I believe that everybody wants to manage this risk and everybody's working to manage this risk. Therefore, I am confident that there won't be a general war in the Middle East. Now we move to a third theater that nobody's talking about, at least we haven't brought it up yet, Taiwan, China, in the Pacific. The United States, it's very similar to the situation we face in Europe. The United States simply lacks the military power to meaningfully challenge China militarily in Taiwan. There's a lot of politics being played, a lot of money being spent, et cetera. But the biggest factor in Taiwan is the elections coming up in January. Those elections will pick a new government, and it's likely that the Kuomintang party, the opposition party, will prevail in these elections at the national level, which means it takes all the steam out of this push towards Taiwanese independence. Even though nobody talks about it, that's what they're talking about. And when that happens, if Taiwan gets a government that's seeking to peacefully reconcile its differences with China, the possibility of armed conflict goes down to near zero. So I'm confident that even though there's a lot of conflict and conflict potential in the world today, that this conflict can be either avoided, as in the case in Taiwan, or be contained locally, as hopefully it can be done in the Middle East, and as it was done in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin deserves a tremendous amount of praise. Nobody will give it to him here in the West, but his escalation management against all the provocations that have been put his way by Ukraine in the West as they turned a Russian-Ukrainian conflict into a Russian conflict against the collective West, against NATO, the United States, as they flooded Ukraine with modern weaponry that has caused harm to Russia. It has caused harm to Russia. It has killed Russians. It has destroyed the Russian equipment. Vladimir Putin didn't overreact. He managed the problem. He persevered. And now we're looking at the real probability of a strategic Russian victory because Vladimir Putin managed the escalation, just like hopefully it will be managed in the Middle East.
Okay, so another question. At the moment, we find ourselves in a new confrontation, and sometimes some say that we are inside the second Cold War. And as you probably know, President Biden put it bluntly at his press conference in January 2021 that it is a new Cold War where democracies like the United States and Britain fight against autocracies, against China and Russia. Is it an exaggeration or miscalculation, or is it true? What do you think? What do you think about his declaration that we are indeed in the second Cold War? And if so, can we avoid it? How can we diminish the level of confrontation?
There can be no doubt that relations between the United States and Russia are among their worst ever. There's also no doubt that the United States and China are on a path of strategic competition that dangerously comes close to being military in nature. The difference is that this isn't a bipolar world, us versus them, that existed during the Cold War. The emergence of the global South, of the developing world, their maturity into a political and economic force in their own right, and Russia and China's ability to leverage influence over the global South to create this multipolarity makes it impossible for there to be a Cold War. because the United States isn't as dominant as we used to be. Europe isn't as dominant as they used to be. And if there's a Cold War, a true Cold War, they'll find themselves increasingly isolated and they'll come out on the losing end. We see that with the blowback from the sanctioning of Russia. Look at what happened in Australia. Australia signed on to this whole confrontation with China. They joined the AUKUS, the Australian United Kingdom U.S. Alliance against China. And yet Xi Jinping just met with the Australian Prime Minister. Why? To get relations back on track. Because China, you can't have a Cold War when you're totally dependent upon the Chinese economy. That's the reality. The United States can't have a Cold War with China because our economy can't survive without China. The global economy can't. China's dominance of the global economic reality is such that you can't cut them out of the picture. It's easier to cut yourself out of the picture, which China doesn't want, but they can make happen. And Russia has wisely aligned themselves with China, created a circumstance that for the time being, you can't separate Russia and China. So there will be no Cold War. I mean, Joe Biden used those words up because it was a frame of reference that most Americans could understand. Most Americans can't understand the complexity of the global reality today. It's easier to exploit the Russophobia that infects the American people with simplistic arguments like this is a new Cold War. It's a dangerous situation. In many ways, it's worse. But again, the reality of the Chinese economy, the reality of the Russian economy is such that Cold War politics won't work anymore. At some point in time, the United States will have to recognize that continued attempts to isolate Russia and China only isolate the United States, only weaken the United States. And we will have to sit back down at the table with the Russians and rethink arms control, rethink nuclear weapons, rethink spheres of influence and things of that nature. That's, I believe, the inevitability. I don't believe war or conflict is inevitable. I believe that peace is inevitable because there are no other options. There really are no other options.
So, as I understand, you do not believe in the Cold War at all. You cannot name all this global mess that with which we face now. You cannot call it the Cold War. It's another situation. It's a kind of complicated situation, but we are far from the real Cold War that we had in the past.
Well, it's something different. The Cold War was bipolarity. It was us versus you, us versus them. Good versus evil, depending on which side you were on, black and white. Today, that doesn't exist. We try to make it about us. We try to talk about American hegemony, but Russia and China aren't saying us. They're not saying me. They're saying we. It's a multipolarity situation. It's a completely different struggle. The American struggle, what's going on, and this is why the Biden administration can't be honest with the American people, because the struggle that's taking place isn't about democracy versus autocracy. It's about hegemony versus multipolarity. It's a struggle between an American hegemon who wants to try to maintain a rules-based international order that was put in place by the United States at the end of the Second World War as a mechanism of controlling the global economy, the global politics. That's failing because as the global South emerges and rises and declares its independence from the United States, from others, no colonialism again, the United States is struggling to do this. And we're struggling against a global South that has attached itself more to China and Russia than they have the United States. That's the nature of the conflict. Hegemony versus multipolarity. That's not a Cold War. That's a completely different geopolitical struggle.
So what is your forecast? Can we avoid a global conflict in the future?
Yes, we definitely can. Can we accidentally stumble into a global conflict? Of course. Mistakes can always be made. When we're not talking, when there's this level of distrust, there's real potential for things to get out of control. But Russia isn't looking for a fight. China isn't looking for a fight. America can't fight. And NATO doesn't even know what it is anymore. So as long as as long as an equilibrium can be maintained. And again, this is where the maturity of a Vladimir Putin and a Xi Jinping come into play, because there are no mature leaders in the West, not Joe Biden, not anybody in Europe. The maturity is coming from the two adults in the room, Russia and China, who aren't trying to score cheap political victories up front to exploit, the strength of their position. They're just trying to secure, a just world, secure their own interests, and then create stability until which time the United States will recognize that it can't be the hegemon, that it must be part of the multipolarity. And then they'll invite America to the table. And I think that, I'm optimistic for the future. It's a dangerous situation, but fortunately, I think the weakness of the United States helps contribute to a positive outcome, because we simply don't have the military power necessary to take on Russia and China at the same time, let alone Iran or engage in the Middle East. We're not the military we used to be in the 1980s.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott, for your very optimistic view on the situation. And I really appreciate your time, that you found time to give us an interview. Thank you very much, and have a good day in America. Greetings from Moscow. Okay, bye-bye.